The record that should end Henry Hudson's fourth voyage is not a ship's log. It is a court file. 9 men went into the boat. None of them came back. The version that survived was written by the men who stayed on the ship. Henry Hudson did not simply disappear. He was removed from the historical record by the only men left alive to explain what happened. The court file was written years after the Discovery came home without its captain, and the men named in it were not neutral witnesses. One document says there was famine, another says there was force. A later published account says the blame belonged mostly to men who were already dead. This episode is not about the famous image of Hudson in a small boat. Henry Hudson left London in the Discovery on 17th of April 1610. The ship was small, the backers were powerful, and the object was old in English ambition, a passage through the north of America to the wealth of Asia. The voyage was paid for by men who had names all over the maps afterward: Sir Thomas Smith, Sir Dudley Digges, John Wolstenholme. They were not funding a romance. They were funding a commercial shortcut. Hudson had already made voyages toward the north and west. In 1609, he had sailed under Dutch employment and entered the river that would later carry his name. By 1610, he was back in English service, with the bark Discovery, with a mixed crew, and with a route that still existed more strongly on maps and in hopes than in confirmed water. The surviving record of this final voyage is broken from the start. Hudson's own journal stops on the 3rd of August, 1610. Thomas Whitehouse left a note before he was forced into the boat. Abacuk Pricket's narrative was printed in 1625, 14 years after the mutiny. The later court records use a different voice: flat, legal, and built for accusation. For the viewer, the cast is easier to read as a case file than as a crew list. Hudson is the captain with a route and a failing command. Pricket is the survivor who later writes the story. Bylot is the navigator who brings the ship home. Green, Wilson, and Jouett are the dead men who absorb most of the blame. Those 4 positions control the ending. The fatal assumption was simple. If Hudson found enough open water, the rations and the crew's loyalty would last until the passage was confirmed. That assumption had 2 weak points. The first was the bay. The second was the ship. Hudson did find a great inland sea. After working through Hudson Strait, Discovery entered the bay that English maps would later attach to him. For a commander looking for a westward opening, the geography could be read as promise. Wide water is an easy thing to mistake for progress when the thing you need is a route beyond it. But the season was moving faster than the expedition. By the autumn of 1610, the Discovery was deep in the southern waters of James Bay. The ship wintered near the bottom of the bay, in country already known and used by Cree people, though the English record barely lets that world speak. That silence matters. The Cree nation of Waskaganish preserves the early contact history differently from the English voyage story. Their account notes that Hudson traded with an Aboriginal person in 1611 and used signs about neighboring Cree trading parties. Later Omushkigo and Cree histories remember the strange wooden vessels and the arrival of new goods as part of a longer story of watching, caution, and exchange. The land was inhabited. The surviving expedition record is written almost entirely from the deck. The winter strained everything. By spring, command was no longer just about navigation. It was about bread. A captain could order a course. He could not order a hungry crew to trust the store. Once the bread became evidence, command had already begun to fail. John Williams, the gunner, died in November. The crew built ashore. They lived through ice, sickness, and narrowing stores. Pricket's account says fowl and fish kept starvation off at times. It also says resentment grew around Hudson's choices, his punishments, and his distribution of food and clothing. This is where Pricket becomes dangerous as a source. He gives details no one else gives. He also writes like a man arranging blame. In Purchas's 1625 publication, Pricket tells us that Henry Green, William Wilson, Robert Jouett, John Thomas, and others were the moving spirits of the mutiny. Notice what that does. By the time the ship reached England, Green, Wilson, Thomas, Pierce, and Jouett were dead. The men who could most easily carry the guilt could not answer. That does not make Pricket false. It makes him interested. By June 1611, the Discovery was free enough to move. Hudson did not immediately turn for England. He still wanted to search. The crew wanted return. Food had become the language of authority. Pricket says that before the final break, Hudson delivered the bread from the bread room, about a pound for each man. The cheese was divided too. He also says the men believed there was more food hidden and that Hudson was not dealing equally with the company. On Monday, 18th of June, according to Pricket's dating, the ship fell again into ice. Pricket's sequence has the plot open by the night of 21st of June. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography, following a later reconstruction, places the approach to Pricket's cabin on the night of 23rd June. The safest date is not a clean single number. It is the night of 22 or 23rd June 1611, depending on which layer of the record you are reading. Pricket's published account says they told him there was less than 14 days victual left for all the company. They meant to shift the company and put Hudson and the sick men into the shallop. That phrase is important. Shift the company sounds almost administrative. What it meant was removal by force. Pricket then gives us a scene in which he resists, warns, asks for delay, and tries to prevent bloodshed. It is one of the most convenient scenes in the whole record. The man who survives to write the account gives himself the role of reluctant witness. I read that scene with a hand on the brake. The document may preserve real speech. It may also preserve what Pricket wished the court and the backers to believe he had said. At dawn, the decision that changed everything came aboard not as a speech, but as an action. Hudson came out of his cabin. Men were waiting. William Wilson pinioned his arms, according to the later testimony and to Pricket's account. John King was trapped below. The shallop was brought up to the ship's side. The sick and the unwanted were called out of their cabins. The names matter because the later legend often reduces the boat to one man. Henry Hudson was forced into the shallop. So was his son John. With them went Arnold Ladley, John King, Michael Butt, Thomas Whitus, Adam Moore, Sidrak Fanner, and Philip Staff, the carpenter. Staff is the one figure the survivor record repeatedly treats as loyal. He could have stayed, but went for love of the master, or so the testimony says. From this point on, the record loses Hudson. On or about 22 to 23rd of June 1611, in the ice near Hudson Strait or the northern exit from James Bay, as the English record phrases it, Hudson, his son, and the others were in the shallop beside the Discovery. Parks Canada dates the mutiny to 23rd June. The indictment record uses 22 June. After the tow line was cut, no verified European record places them again. What happened next depends on which document is on the table. Pricket's 1625 account says the boat had some powder, shot, pikes, an iron pot, meal, and other things. It says the shallop was tied to the stern as Discovery stood out of the ice. It says the line was cut when they were near clear water. It says that when the shallop came again within sight, the ship made more sail and fled as from an enemy. The trial material gives a plainer version. The indictment says the men were put into the shallop without food, drink, fire, clothing, or necessaries. That is the legal accusation. The survivor testimony softens it. Pricket and Bylett both emphasize want of victuals, suddenness, and the dead mutineers as the principals. This is where the legend and the record separate. The popular version says Henry Hudson was abandoned by mutineers, and that is true as far as it goes. The records say something narrower and more uncomfortable. The only detailed narrative of the abandonment comes from a survivor whose 1625 account appeared 14 years later, while the court record heard men whose freedom depended on making the act look like famine, not murder. This is what we know. The Discovery returned without Hudson. Hudson, his son, and 7 others were forced or sent into the shallop on or about 22 or 23 June 1611. The men on the ship divided and sold clothing and goods left behind. Several principal mutineers died before the ship reached England. The surviving men were examined, and some were later put into a murder proceeding rather than punished cleanly for mutiny. This is what we do not know. We do not know exactly how much food went into the shallop. We do not know whether Hudson reached shore. We do not know what Cree or Inuit people may have seen after the Discovery sailed away, because no indigenous account tied securely to Hudson's party survives from that moment. We do not know whether Pricket's self-portrait as reluctant observer is confession, defense, or both. After the boat was left behind, the Discovery became its own survival case. The men had removed their captain, but they still had to cross the same bay, the same strait, and the same hunger. They sailed toward the Digges Islands in search of food. There they encountered Inuit. The English account turns the encounter quickly into violence. Green, Wilson, Thomas, and Pierce were mortally wounded or killed. Juet died later at sea. Again, the record is one-sided. The English survivors describe themselves as attacked. The indigenous side of that encounter is not preserved in the same archive, and the episode should not pretend otherwise. We can say the landing party was desperate for food. We can say the encounter turned violent. We cannot safely narrate the motives of the Inuit men from the English record alone. By the time the Discovery reached home, the ship carried a story with many of its most useful villains already buried at sea or left in northern water. That mattered legally. The Trinity House list made a simple division: the men turned out of the ship, the men slain, the men who came home. Abacuk Pricket appears there not as master or officer, but as a landman put in by the adventurers. Robert Bylot, the navigator, came home too. So did Edward Wilson, the surgeon, Adrian Motter, Nicholas Sims, Sylvanus Bond, Bennett Matthews, and Francis Clemens. The authorities did not simply ignore the matter. The survivors were examined. The High Court of Admiralty records show a true bill against Robert Bylot, Abacuk Pricket, Edward Wilson, Adrian Matter, Sylvanus Bond, and Nicholas Sims. The accusation was that they had pinioned Hudson, put him and the others into the shallop, and maliciously abandoned them so that they died. The evidence here is not legend or a painting. It is a legal accusation with names attached. That is the part a thumbnail cannot show. But the case that survived is fragmented. Modern summaries often say the trial came in 1618 and ended in acquittal. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography states that 4 men were arraigned before the Admiralty Court, charged with murder rather than mutiny, and acquitted. It also gives the sentence this episode turns on. Pricket's truthfulness has naturally been questioned because he had to save his own character and the characters of living comrades. That is the second receipt. Janvier's reproduction of the records is more cautious about the surviving file, noting that parts of the proceeding are missing and that the punishment, if any, is not recorded there. There is no clean record of punishment. There is no satisfying courtroom reckoning. Look closely at Bylot's testimony. He says Green was principal. He names Thomas, Wilson, Juet, and Pierce. He says he thought the men in the boat were being held while the ship was searched for victuals. He says Green and the others would not let them return. He says no one shot at Hudson after he was in the boat. He denies taking a ring from Hudson's pocket. Bylot removes himself from foreknowledge. Pricket removes himself from consent. Both put the heaviest initiative on dead men. Both keep returning to hunger, and hunger was real. That is why the case cannot be flattened into a simple lie. The Discovery had wintered in ice. Men were sick. The food was low. Hudson's authority had deteriorated. The Northwest Passage had not appeared. The fatal assumption had broken in both halves. The rations could not sustain the ambition of the route. The loyalty of the crew could not survive the winter that the route required. Pricket's 14-year gap then did the rest. When Purchas printed the larger discourse in 1625, readers received a coherent story. The captain difficult, the crew starving, the worst mutineers dead, Pricket reluctant, the survivors pitiable, the ending unknowable. The trial record is less satisfying. It gives names, charges, examinations, denials, and gaps. It does not give Hudson's last day after the rope was cut. Theories about Hudson's fate survive because the record does not. He may have tried for shore. He may have died of exposure or hunger. He may have reached land for a time. Waskaganish local history preserves one later interpretation that his party may have died on Danby Island. But that is not an English eyewitness record of the shallop after separation. No verified record carries Hudson past 22 or 23 June 1611. The most honest reconstruction stops there. It can point to geography, possible shorelines, and later Cree memory of early European ships in James Bay. It cannot turn possibility into scene. The author's verdict is this: the Hudson Mutiny was not only a crime of abandonment, it was a crime whose archive was built by the beneficiaries of abandonment. That does not mean every survivor lied. It means the record we inherited was filtered through survival, fear, patronage, and legal danger before it became history. The men who returned had knowledge England wanted. They knew Hudson Bay. They knew the route. Bylot would sail north again. Pricket would be useful enough to appear in later expedition history. No surviving source tells us what Hudson said after the Discovery made sail. No surviving source tells us whether his son watched the ship disappear into the ice. What survives is the story told by the ship, and the ship came home without them.